Thank you, Mitchell, and thank you, IoT Nation and Internet Society's New York chapter for hosting this, and the sponsors that Mitchell mentioned. Glad to be here. I could have listened to that panel for a lot longer, learning a lot with every question and answer. And I'm going to cover a lot of similar themes, but maybe give a little different or broader perspective on things. So hopefully it'll line up here. So we're talking about IoT. How many of you see this as an opportunity? Most. How many of you see it as a threat? About an equal number. I asked that question to a group of Canadian ISPs, and the threat side of the house was much bigger because they're very concerned about billions of devices attacking the network itself, as we saw a couple of years ago this month. So just out of curiosity, in the room here, who is involved in offering IoT products or services? Directly, a good number of you. Okay, how many of you have an IoT, a smart device in your home? Almost everybody, okay. So I think we can all relate to this very much, if nothing else, as consumers. So it is a huge opportunity. Bert talked about some numbers. The one we kind of picked here was 35 billion devices by 2022. They all vary, but they're all big. So we know that it's happening, and it's happening in a big way. And there is opportunity in a variety of places. For most of this talk, I'm going to focus more on the consumer aspect and what consumer manufacturers should do about security and privacy in IoT. But this slide is particularly enterprise projects, 1,600 enterprise projects, and it kind of breaks them down by type, just to give you a sense of where those projects are happening. So smart city was number 1, connected industry and connected buildings 2 and 3, and so on down the line. And then you can see in that map in the lower middle kind of where the activity is happening, mostly North America, second is Asia, and so forth. And you can kind of see the arrows on the right there showing whether the trend is up or down for each of those segments. But it's happening very broadly and in a lot of different segments. And depending on where you are in the world, the order of these segments will flip. Like if you look in Africa, it's very much smart agriculture and some of those kind of things that are fundamental to society, as opposed to maybe consumer IoT, which we tend to think of here in the US. This is a snapshot from middle of last year of smart home market. You can see some of the growth happening. The top countries, the US is leading in this area. And the top products there on the lower right are gateways and speakers, security systems, and so forth. And there's a lot of data on this, mostly trending in the same direction, although the details vary. But so there is huge opportunity to increase efficiency and convenience and all sorts of things. There are a lot of good business reasons. If it's a business application, there are a lot of good reasons for consumers to be using IoT. The problem is, and the panel kind of brought this to the surface, a lot of consumers don't even know that there are security and privacy risks. They're buying these devices for their convenience, many cases, or efficiency, in the case of energy maybe, and they aren't even thinking about what's underneath. And we'll get to the fact that even if you want to know what's underneath, it's hard to find, which you guys pointed out in the panel. So we need to consider when we're looking at the threats that are introduced by IoT devices, both internal and external. And by that I mean internal would be, if you think of consumer in your own home, what are the threats to you in your environment? External is, how could those same devices be used to attack the internet itself? Or a portion of the internet, as we saw with the Mirai botnet 2 years ago, and we've seen in other cases as well. Threats do make headlines. These are several of them from roughly October last year through April of this year. I was on a panel at the RSA conference where we talked about these topics, and these were sort of a sample of headlines that I used. Then I spoke at another conference in June, and just in that few-month window, there were quite a few more. One of my favorite that was on that previous slide was the hacker who, they called it Brickbot. He was so upset at the fact that devices could be easily hacked that he would hack the devices and brick them, which if you haven't heard that term, it means you just make them unusable. And so that was his way of just taking them out of the game. So why that hacker? Maybe the people who own those devices didn't think so, I'm sure. But anyway, so there are a lot of headlines. This cute little dog was as a baby monitor that was tracking a mother around the room as she was nursing her child. She asked her husband, "Is that you?" No. So, yeah. Anyway, and then just in the last couple weeks, in fact, one of these is today, the Who's Watching Your TV, Sony quietly killed 3 critical bugs in their smart TV. That was from this morning. So there's always something going on. And it's not really the fact that there are vulnerabilities in IoT, it's that the systems need to be able to be updated and quickly patched to address those. I know if you're like me with my smartphone, I get up some mornings and 43 of my applications have been updated, and a lot of those are security patches, you know, but it just kind of happens silently under the covers. That's the way IoT should work, but it doesn't always work that way because the manufacturers aren't building in the mechanisms and the headroom to allow that kind of thing to happen. They're using hard-coded passwords that anybody on the internet can find out what they are and go attack that device. They're not leaving enough room to do proper software firmware upgrades, all that kind of thing. So there's a lot of danger. The lower right one here is Bruce Schneier, a famous security researcher. They did some research and found they could do an attack on high energy use appliances in homes and essentially bring down an electrical grid. If they were to hit all the air conditioners in a community at the same time, for instance. So there's a lot of ways that these can be used to attack not only inside, but outside the owner's realm. So here's another way to think about all this. This is kind of the risk spectrum, mostly for the internal, but it could be applied externally. You've got everything from, on the left, annoying. That might be somebody's messing with the volume on your TV, or they're changing the channel or music that you're listening to. Annoying. Creepy. They're watching you. They're listening to you. You don't know what they're going to do with it, but super creepy. Probably illegal. Then you have digital theft. So they're breaking into your home's network and getting onto your laptops or your smartphone and stealing information, identity theft kind of stuff. And then you've got, and this is where IoT introduces, and the panelists talked about it, physical hazards, unlocking doors, opening garage doors, bringing down the electrical grid, as I just said, messing with thermostats in either the hot or cold part of the year. There's all sorts of ways that this can really have a huge impact on the physical safety of people. So these all need to be taken into consideration. Why is IoT such a challenge? Why is it different? And the panel addressed this somewhat, but just to kind of look at it from the 3 major groups involved, for the manufacturers, a lot of it has to do with the form factor. There's a cost and size combination that they're trying to achieve with these devices that doesn't leave much room for battery power, for headroom in memory and processing, or encryption and the kind of things you would want to do. They're not nearly as powerful as the smartphones we carry around, and they cost a lot less. And so those combinations really drive them to not include security and privacy by design up front. Time to market, especially for startups, is a huge thing. Adding in security and privacy slows things down, and it's going to mean more support after the fact. And so that comes into play as well. And then future-proofing is usually not even thought of, especially in a startup environment. Now, some of these manufacturers also are coming from more the hard goods side of the industry, and so they don't even know what it means to connect anything to the internet. And so they're sort of, just naive about what they're doing in that space. Services, and by that I mean these are sort of like your ISPs that are offering services, or maybe home security companies. There's all sorts of new uses happening with all these devices that they've never contemplated before. Bandwidth, different types of use. The volume is orders of magnitude above what they're used to. So that's a challenge as well. They're dealing with naive players here, refers to the manufacturers, not the services people. So it's what are the manufacturers doing to properly address security and privacy? And then a lot of times they don't have much insight into what's going on inside that traffic. Wired did a great article earlier this year about a home in San Francisco where they put a handful of smart devices in the home, and then they did a traffic monitor to see what was going on. And those things are very chatty. They're always phoning home. And it's hard to know, are they looking for software updates? Are they sending data, which maybe they should or shouldn't be doing? Even when no one is in the home and none of the services were theoretically being used, there was a lot of traffic going on. And so that's a huge consideration as well. And then there's the consumers. They're, for the most part, flying blind. As it says there on the bottom, they're trying to do it themselves like they've done with most other things they bring into their home. They really don't, I says naive users, they may try to figure out security and privacy, but it's almost impossible to figure it out ahead of time unless you're an attorney. And I think Ken said even if you are an attorney, you might not be able to figure it out, or Bert said that. And so that information is not bubbled up to the top very well for anybody in a meaningful way. If you try to figure out what are the security issues associated with any given device, you're pretty much going to have to do an internet search for that device and the word vulnerability or hack or something to figure out if there's a problem there. Otherwise, you're probably not going to know until you have it. Now, there are things you can do after the fact to help protect yourselves regardless of what you've bought, but it's very difficult up front, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Another factor to look at is the attack reach, and so this kind of plays in with all these other factors. So what I mean by that is you can look at the two axes here, number of devices that would be affected from low to high across the bottom and then near to far across the top. And a home Wi-Fi attack would be an example of the lower left, where to attack that network, I have to be within range of that home, and I'm only going to hit a few devices. Whereas if I do something like Mirai or something else, IoT worm, I can affect hundreds of thousands or millions of devices from anywhere in the world. And this is a risk assessment sort of thing. And a lot of companies that are doing IoT products aren't thinking that way. I mean, not that it's okay to have any vulnerabilities, but you certainly don't want to have those in the upper right. And you want to restrict them as much as you can to ones that might happen in the lower left. I mean, if somebody's outside your home, they could also break a window, right? Doesn't mean it's okay to let them hack your Wi-Fi, but there are trade-offs there in terms of risk. And then we have privacy. I think that was pretty well covered in the panel, but it all comes down to what data you're collecting, what are you going to do with it, who are you going to share it with, whether or not I accept the privacy policy, is that going to affect my functionality? Like if I get down the lines of text on my smart TV privacy policy and I say, oh, no, I don't want to accept this privacy policy, can I still watch TV? Or do I lose some of the smart features? I don't know. And then choice and control, and that's GDPR has a lot about choice and control. There are other different kind of frameworks that address that, but all those come into play and they're very important. So what are some common mistakes that we've seen? And we started getting into this about 3.5 years ago, looking at the different principles that should be involved in IoT. One of the biggest one is default or hard-coded passwords. So if every device has the same password, that's one thing. If they're hard-coded, that's horrible. At least default ones can be changed, although they're easily, I think there's a website that's the 60 passwords that caused the Mirai botnet. So it's pretty easy to find these default passwords out there. Another big problem if devices are not updatable at all, and it's usually because they don't have the headroom to do that. As Bert said, I think one of the things that should happen is you should be supporting software updates for some period of time that's stated. No encryption is a big issue because a lot of the hacks that you see are because things are sent in plain text. A lot of these things are thrown together as kind of puzzle pieces put together into a product and put out in the market. And a lot of times the software stacks that are used are ones that have vulnerabilities that have been known for years, and yet they aren't tested in the context of that product, and they're put out in the market, and therefore highly vulnerable from day one. Not looking at risk assessment. Data vacuuming, that's a term I heard at a smart home conference, and I love it, especially in the context of a smart home conference. And that is collect everything you possibly can and then figure out what to do with it later, which I think if you rewind several years, a lot of IoT manufacturers were kind of doing that. kind of along the lines of a lot of the Web 2.0, social network type services that had cropped up. I don't see that happening as much now. They're much more focused on what is our business model, and it's not figuring out how to use the data later. But that's an important thing, especially as related to all these new privacy laws that are coming into play and doing the right thing regarding privacy. And then the last one is lack of a life cycle view. So in some realms, consumer electronics kind of have this throwaway mentality. I'm going to throw it away after a couple of years. I'm going to upgrade it in a couple of years, like my tablets and laptops and smartphones. These are not the kind of devices you just pull out after a couple of years and replace them. If you think of, traditionally at least, thermostats and locks and refrigerators and garage door openers and all those kind of things, those have long life cycles, decades in many cases. So what are you going to do when you can't do the security patches for the refrigerator anymore? Do you shut down the internet connectivity and now it's just a refrigerator, not a smart refrigerator? Is there a module you can upgrade? I mean, there's all sorts of ways to approach it, but it needs to be taken into account from the beginning if you're gonna do the right thing as a manufacturer. Another very similar one is reprovisioning these things. So think of a smart home. Most of you said you had some smart thing in your house. You're gonna sell your house. You've got a dozen different devices that go with the house. How are you gonna hand off those accounts and wipe your data so people don't have access to your history? I've heard so many people say, I still get the smart thermostat reports every month, and I still can go in and mess with the temperature if I want to, and they haven't had the house for a year. That's not good. And so you got to take all that kind of stuff into account. So you need to have that life cycle view. How does this play into what consumers are thinking? This is a survey done by Parks Associates, who's focused for a long time on smart home. And third and fourth on this, or I guess fourth and fifth on this list are most essential characteristics are that the products are secure and private, so it tends to score pretty high there. And then what do you care about in terms of actually making purchase decisions? Number 3 is privacy and security. Now, I don't know if this is borne out in actual purchases, and I think because the data I've seen kind of doesn't reflect that people make choices where the actual purchases are driven by that. And I think a lot of that has to do with what I talked about earlier of lack of information. They would like to do it, but they really can't. There's no easy mechanism to figure out what's got good security and privacy in it. And then you might trade that off against the cost, but if you don't know, then you just sort of ignore it ultimately. So how can we address this issue? Well, anything that addresses it, we believe, should look at 2 major dimensions and look at them holistically. So the first is to look at the entire system. So in our definition, that's made up of the devices and sensors themselves, the apps that control it, and the cloud services that back it up. Often, security and privacy are talked about only in the context of the devices and sensors. But if you have an app that is vulnerable, your whole system is just as vulnerable as if it was in the devices. Likewise with the cloud. An example of this is, I think it was earlier this year, it might have been late last year, LG had a vulnerability in their mobile app that controlled their appliances. You could hack it, get control of all the appliances, which included a robot vacuum cleaner that had a camera on it that you could just drive it around the house and see everything that was in the house. It also included their washing machines and refrigerators. They patched it very quickly. In fact, a lot of these things you hear about actually get patched before you hear about them. Responsible vulnerability disclosures are such that security researchers find the problem, they notify the manufacturer. By the time most of us hear about it, it's already addressed. But it goes to the point of it needs to be updatable. You need to have good vulnerability reporting as a manufacturer so you can hear about that stuff. And as a consumer, you need to make sure you're using the latest software and firmware. Like that Sony story from today, evidently they patched it late August, early September, and part of this story coming out is to make sure people are informed, to make sure they're on the latest software update for the TVs. Yes?
It has to be securely patchable.
Securely patchable. Great point.
Downloads are as bad or not worse than no downloads.
Yeah, so, and in fact, I'm going to get to, in the next couple slides, to the principles that we have for, that should be followed for proper security and privacy, and that is one of them, that the downloads themselves need to be authenticated and secure. In fact, look, there it is. Okay, I'm going to go back for a second. So you also need to address the full range of consumer concerns, which I already kind of talked about. So not just security, which a lot of people just think in that mindset, not just privacy, but also this extension, this life cycle aspect, which most frameworks really don't cover. They might cover little bits and pieces of it, but the mindset really isn't there. So over the past 3.5 years, we've developed a framework. It was first released in early 2016. It's gone through a few revisions now. Has 40 principles of what should be addressed by manufacturers in their offerings. And this does cover the devices, the apps, and the back-end services. It can kind of go into these 8 buckets. I'll just pick and choose a few examples from each bucket. So encryption, encrypting data in transit and at rest, fairly straightforward, but rarely done by these products. Updates, you should be able to update them securely, as we talked about just now. Security, vulnerability testing and penetration testing before you ship the product. Some of these are very, very common sense. Most manufacturers we've talked to about this over the last couple of years say, yeah, of course. Why would I not do that? And then we say, well, why aren't you doing it? The natural follow-on question. And it's really a matter of kind of product life cycle. They know they should do it. They'll get there over the next several product life cycles. And so they're starting to move in that direction. Some of these are actually, some of the privacy recommendations and the disclosures and some of the communications is how do you communicate with your users securely, because there have actually been cases where users have gotten phished where someone pretends to be the IoT manufacturer. They say, I have a software update for your security camera. They click on a link and then they download malware into their security camera, and now their network is vulnerable. So, I mean, you have to really look at all angles of this thing. It's important to look at the whole thing, as I said. As I mentioned, we really focused on the consumer segment with these recommendations, not that they don't apply to other areas. The reason we did that is that in almost every other area, industrial use, smart cities, smart cars, medical devices, there's somebody that has oversight over that process. So it's a network administrator in the case of an industrial environment or a smart city. It's regulators mostly in the case of smart cars or medical devices. But obviously there are, overlaps here and there, and these do apply. During the process of developing this framework, we had over 100 different stakeholders involved in the process. So we had everything from industry to academia to retailers of IoT products, to industry, a lot of supply chain as well as end device manufacturers, and then lots of internet privacy attorneys representing consumers. And so we really tried to find the right balance in this that would be practical but not onerous and restrict innovation for companies. We also developed this, and this is one thing I wanted to talk about real quick, with kind of in mind that it could be used as a foundation for a certification or trustmark program. And in our mind, that's an important step at some point for the IoT industry, where that security and privacy information can be bubbled up to the surface in a simple to digest way, like a mark or a rating, so a consumer can know somebody's looked at that and it's good. Now, given the fact that these are mostly software-based products, it could be good today, bad tomorrow, but it still means someone has looked at it and said, we're following all these right principles, and it's better than not knowing. And so that's kind of how we're looking at it. So we call our campaign, if you want to think of it that way, of advocating for better security and privacy in IoT, trust by design. We sort of roll security and privacy together into trust. And there are sort of 3 audiences that we would like to reach through this and ask them to do something about it. So the first is manufacturers and distribution chain, retailers, service providers, like Comcast is selling smart home bundles into homes, for instance. To actually look at this trust framework, and publicly commit to comply with it at a certain level. Not that they've done everything already. I already mentioned the answer we get on that one. But that they're committing to a high percentage of them and that they will fulfill the remainder of them over some period of time. The second is consumers, and mostly that has to do with education. How do we raise the level of awareness so that they can make informed choices and demand better products? I think you heard Ken talk about the fact that business to business, they're demanding these privacy things baked in from the beginning, and it's a competitive differentiator. We want to see the same thing for consumers. And then finally, in the policy area, to use these guidelines as sort of a framework to look at what the proper security and privacy features should be. So for retailers, I kind of talked about this already. Whoever has their name on the product, they're committing to it and the services that back it up. Push it back through their supply chain to these software stacks and some of the pieces that they roll into their products. And especially for service providers, we talk to them about curating their offerings. So they're only offering products that kind of clear this bar, and they don't have a mix, creating a vulnerability in their offering. For consumer organizations, you can come from a lot of different angles, but a lot of IoT product reviews really focus on price and functionality, and they don't include security and privacy. And we'd like to see that become part of the criteria at some level and then grow. Use them to help educate consumers to make smart choices. So one of the steps we've taken in this area is a partnership we announced a few months ago with Consumers International. And for those of you who don't know who they are, they're actually a membership organization made up of all the kind of consumer testing organizations you've probably heard of around the world. So Consumer Reports in the US is the big flagship one. Which in the UK is another choice in Australia. And they're also tied into the consumer products agencies in many of the governments around the world. So they have over 200 members in 100 countries, and a lot of them are focused on better security and privacy digitally, and IoT is kind of now the tip of that spear. So we're going to be working with them to help educate consumers and get the word out more. Policymakers, there was a lot of talk in the panel about the balance of regulation and self-regulation for the industry. We certainly would tilt toward if we can do it without laws, that would be better. But there may be some requirement to do that in some parts of the world. But certainly policymakers can help strengthen the accountability of who's responsible for problems when they occur. This trustability signals is back to that certification and Trustmark thing. Stakeholders, all of them involved, service providers, manufacturers, and so forth, kind of incorporate these principles. And then they can actually, as a purchaser, and there's a bill that's been before Congress for over a year and hasn't moved at all, but it was introduced last October, bare minimum. The US government would only buy products that didn't have default hard-coded passwords, that didn't ship with significant known vulnerabilities and could be software updated. That's sort of, I would call it table stakes for this kind of deal. Like, it's kind of brain dead obvious, but having a small bar like that, the recent California bill that passed that goes into effect January of 2020, I think they originally called it the Teddy Bear and Toasters law when it first got introduced like early last year, and it finally passed now. It says that IoT devices should have reasonable security, and I think the only specific thing they called out was not hard-coded passwords, that they had to be either changed on first use or unique to each device that shipped. So again, that's sort of barely stepping up, but it is stepping up. So policymakers are an important thing. And we really see this as a virtuous cycle. So if consumers demand better products and they put pressure on policymakers and manufacturers step up, especially leading manufacturers, and use this as a competitive differentiator, we can kind of see an upward spiral happening in IoT. So we have created a lot of resources to help. This is a place that I should mention, kind of OTA versus Internet Society. Mitchell did a great job of introducing kind of both. Just for a tiny bit of background information, OTA was a nonprofit that started over 10 years ago, focused on kind of identifying and promoting security and privacy best practices for enterprises that attach to the internet, and helping create better consumer confidence in their online transactions as a result. So where the Internet Society traditionally has been focused more on the infrastructure of the internet, so we rolled into Internet Society a year and a half ago, and we complement each other very well. So this IoT work that we had done has now been adopted by the entire organization around the world, and we're promoting it in every region. We have some other work that we do that we're doing that with as well. But these are some resources that we've created and kind of under two different brands here, you might say. But the principles are in the upper left there. There's a summary version of it. Then there's the full list of 40 with a little bit of explanation about them. There's some white papers. We did a smart home checklist, like if you're a consumer, what should you be thinking about? There's another consumer checklist on the upper right here. Earlier this year, we released a enterprise IoT security checklist because we're seeing more, and we released that at the RSA conference, we're seeing more and more that consumer IoT is coming through the side and back door into enterprises, usually not known or managed by IT staff, and it can introduce the same kind of vulnerabilities there that you see in homes with maybe more severe consequences. And so this is a checklist of what should you do in the enterprise to help protect yourself. And some of it has to do with buy the right things, but the rest has to do with what do you do with them once you've got them. And then finally, we have an IoT security for policymakers white paper. There's some other papers coming here soon that will complement that. And we're going to continually be adding to these resources over time. So just talk real quickly, summarize what's going on in the world of frameworks and certifications and all that around the world, because we track this as closely as we can, and we're involved in most of these. So this is a sampling of frameworks that are out there. There are frameworks that are exclusively focused on security or interoperability or whatever. We're trying to look at the ones that have a broader level of coverage. So we have ours there on the left. ENISA is doing one that kind of covers the whole EU. The UK did one, it's right in the middle there, covered up a little bit, called Secure by Design. It has 13 principles that overlap about 30 of our 40, or align with 30 of our 40, I would say. They released that in March, asked for comments. They're going to release an update this month, we understand. So we'll see where they landed there. But it is focused on consumer IoT, and they're calling it a code of conduct and saying to manufacturers, you should be doing this stuff, and we're going to watch you, and if you don't, we're going to put some more teeth to this. So they aren't legislating it yet, but they're sort of pushing in that direction. The upper right there is from Australia, and we are involved in that one as well, the Internet of Things Security Guidelines. They incorporated almost all of our principles into their document, and they're going to be coming out with more detail to this. So we're glad to see this kind of thing going on. And then NIST, I don't know how many of you follow NIST. That's the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, I think is what it stands for. They've released 3 IoT things in the last couple of weeks, and comments are due in the next month for all of them, and they're voluminous papers, but they're very active in IoT. Privacy, security, kind of trust as an overriding umbrella, so they're really trying to give people good guidance there. In terms of the testing and certification, Trustmarks, some of those programs I already mentioned will include, like in Australia, we understand that they're going to have sort of a Trustmark element that comes along with that, that's in the works. But the ones that are publicly known today, UL has one they call CAP. I think it's Cybersecurity Assurance Program, if I'm not mistaken. The IoT Security Foundation, based in the UK, has one where there's a Trustmark you can submit and get approved. The Consumer Reports sponsored something called the Digital Standard, which they've done one report on 5 smart TVs that was released earlier this year. And it's kind of an open source criteria. You can go to their site and give feedback if you want. And CTIA, just a month or so ago, released one for devices that do cellular or Bluetooth connections, which is many of them. And so they have a certification plan that they've released. In the policy area, and this is mainly legislation, although there's a little bit that's not. So there's 2 bills from a year ago in the US Congress. I mentioned one already as a purchaser. The other was to establish a committee to come up with requirements for IoT devices. And then through a committee process, a committee of experts process, so a multi-stakeholder kind of process. And then apply and define some kind of mark that would be associated with that. It would be a voluntary mark. The California law just passed, is on the lower left there. The NTIA did a multi-stakeholder process a year or two ago on security upgradability and patching. We were involved in that. So there's recommendations on what companies should say to consumers about that. There have been some reports to the president. And then this one on the right is very interesting because it's the first, I think, in what will be a series of multi-stakeholder efforts in countries focused on what to do with IoT. So this one in Canada, and we're kind of the facilitator of it, I guess you would say, kicked off in April with about 100 participants, and they self-formed into working groups. And the two most active working groups are user education and labeling. And I guess the third one, network resiliency. So the network resiliency is coming from the operator standpoint. Don't let things attack the network. The labeling is kind of this Trustmarks certification idea. So they're pushing forward on that. And the consumer education is raise awareness, and how do we do that best? But that has involved a wide range of stakeholders and is trying to find the right balance between government regulation or policy and industry and everything else. We're seeing similar efforts crop up now in France, Senegal, Portugal, and so we're expecting that to continue. And we think it's a proper way to do it is to get all stakeholders at the table, understand their needs, and then find the right balance. Now, for those of you technical folks, how many of you know what IETF is? A few, okay. So that's the standards board that is hosted at the Internet Society. There are several standards underway that are related to IoT, and I'm not going to walk through all these. Probably the one that's the furthest along and somewhat interesting related to what we've just talked about is the first one, MUD. Great name. Manufacturer usage description. What this is the manufacturer can put a description of what their device is and what kind of communication you should expect from it on the internet. And so when someone sees a device of that type, let's say it's a dishwasher that should only talk to certain places, if you see it start to beaconing out to everywhere, it's being used as a part of a DDoS attack, you can shut it down. So this sort of gives you a definition of what is normal for these kind of devices. So it's another aspect that you can look at to help contain things, which is a great thing. And then there's a lot of others as well that are related to IoT. The next IETF meeting, these were all, we do what's called a rough guide to each IETF meeting in all these different topical areas. So these were all extracted out of the rough guide for the one in Montreal a few months ago. The next one is in Bangkok, Thailand next month, and there'll be an update to all these on what's going on. So let's start to wrap up here. IoT security and privacy is all of our responsibility because we all have a role to play, whether we're a consumer, manufacturer, policymaker, and anything else in between. And how can you get involved? So you've heard me talk about trust by design and these principles. I would encourage you to download and look at this framework and just get an idea of what's in it. There's a 2-page summary of it, and then there's like a 6-page full-blown version of it. If you are a manufacturer or someone else who could start to adopt these principles and bake them into your offerings, we would very much encourage you to do that and like to talk to you about that, because we're initiating a program where we're going to get people to publicly commit, put their logos on a website, and start to show the world that there's movement here, and manufacturers are stepping up. So if you're in that audience, we would appreciate talking to you. Educate consumers on what should go on. We had some checklists there that are very useful with that. And then as far as engaging with the Internet Society, Greg gave you a rundown and an invite for the New York chapter. You can be an individual member, you can be involved in any of the chapters, as Greg said, or we do have organizational membership if you want to join as a company and kind of be inside the tent on a lot of the work that we're doing. So that's it. Thank you for your attention. Did you want to do questions? Okay.
Greg, thank you so much. What we'll do is we'll have some audience questions, and then we'd also like to get into a little bit of discussion after a few questions to understand, be thinking about like what are some of the concerns maybe that you haven't brought up already, what are some of the concerns or some of the practices that you're, either concerns that you have about IoT security and privacy, or some of the practices that you are using in your everyday life in your company? So we'll start with questions, and we'll bring microphones around. So who has question? Okay, one. Anyone else have questions? Two, three. Okay.
Thank you.
Alvaro Neira. I remember when I bought my first PC, 8088, you had the user groups. Now you have social networks. So is there any point or any issue with looking forward and seeing any discontinuities as we have like virtual reality, as you know, these smart devices create all kinds of new ways of interaction, and the framework keeps up with it?
Yeah, that's a good question, and certainly it is moving faster than a lot of us can comprehend with virtual reality and AI and everything else you apply to all this data. We consider that our framework, and I think most of the other organizations that are doing a framework, sort of a living document, and we plan to update it over time, so we're always looking at new things that are coming out. One thing I didn't mention as part of this talk is we have seen over the last couple of years a convergence. A lot of us kind of started in maybe a bit of isolation, and then now we're starting to cross-reference each other's work and build on each other's work, which I see as very much a positive. There's sort of a really strong common core to all of our recommendations, and then some things around the edge because maybe we're looking at it from a slightly different angle, each of us. But I see all of these organizations really looking to enhance that over time and address some of those new issues as they come up. It's going to be hard to predict exactly what they are until we see some of the impact. Yes?
Bob Gezelter, a suggestion. When you talk about marking things and for compliance and such, and you have living documents, there's a big mismatch there.
Yep.
On revision levels, that people say X compliant, and the problem is that X compliant 1995-4473B, and C changed something, and it goes on and on down that rat hole. So if you're going that route of marking things, you need to make sure the mark includes in some way the rev level of the spec it's referencing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would
Otherwise,
see,
it's going to be mayhem.
yeah, no, totally understand. And I would see that the framework that I talk about at a high level would be more of a living document than any specific certification program. I don't think they are 100% linked at all times. So in other words, what you're testing against may be a little more steady over time than the framework evolving. So you have best practices that can continue to evolve, and how often and how exactly they make their way into some kind of testing program can be distinct. Does that make sense?
Okay, I'll just say it out loud. Comment repeated. Well, I don't want to like one.
Yeah,
The comment is repeated to the extent that please encourage in the spec that if people cite the spec, they cite the version they're citing.
absolutely.
Otherwise, it will be head bashing
Right, I agree.
as time goes on. We're both in compliant with subparagraph C, except one's at 473 and one's at 474, and
Right,
it's bad news.
yeah. Yes.
So I'm going to ask this question actually as a consumer.
Okay.
I don't want to like put anyone on the hook or anything, but are there any companies that are doing a really good job of being transparent around this kind of stuff that I could look to as a consumer? And sidebar, I think that a lot of people, especially my generation, look to YouTubers, for example. So have you even seen one case of a YouTuber or someone, or even from a consumer education standpoint, have you guys reached out to any maybe in that area to raise consumer awareness?
Yeah, great suggestion. And we actually do have an effort underway right now to reach out to social influencers like YouTubers about IoT. So it's in the works. On the, what is the first part of your question? I'm sorry, just.
Is there anyone, like, I don't want you to put anyone on the.
Oh, good, companies are doing it right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to name any names right now, but I can tell you that we have talked to many companies that are doing, the high 30s out of those 40 principles today and are committed, and I think you'll see that publicly over some not too long a period of time. But I go to a lot of smart home conferences to interact with these folks and find out what's going on, and it's great to hear, especially a lot of these leading companies talk very strongly from the stage about security and privacy and how important it is and core it is to what they're doing. Obviously, they have to act upon that. They can't just say it. But if you look at what's going on, some of them have had public vulnerabilities that have happened, but they've patched them right away. No different than the operating systems we all use and the products we all use. So it's not a matter of did they do something perfectly that never has a problem. It's did they build in the right things to take care of it quickly on behalf of and not leave their customers exposed. And so there are a lot of companies doing that. Yes?
Michael Elling. So in all of this work, it's an incredible amount of work and standards and frameworks and certifications and governments and associations. Are there any heretical whispering that maybe we have to rethink the data paradigm, that we have to get away from this permissionless and go more towards a permission system so the sender has some of the risk than just purely the receiver? In all of this, any sort of hint at that?
Yeah, I think there is. A lot of that is being driven by consumer protection and privacy laws in other parts of the world, which are going to impact, the question of the panel in many cases was, what do you do as a manufacturer? Well, you kind of have to go with the, I guess I would call it most highest common denominator. Like what's the highest bar you have to clear? And if you clear it everywhere in the world, then you're clearing it everywhere where it's lower. And so some of the informed consent and control over your data is part of those new privacy paradigms. And so we definitely see it moving in that direction. The principles that we have in our framework align very closely with that.
I should have put in a caveat. When you look at call it the informational stack and the layers, and as well the edge and the core, we saw AWS, the news last week that there are pencil-sized chips being inserted into servers. We're not even protecting against those sorts of things happening. So even if the manufacturers try to implement these safeguards higher up in the stack, what assurance do we have lower down or farther out to the edge that there is compliance? So that gets to this whole thought of rethinking our data paradigms.
Yeah, and permission from consumers wouldn't address that specific issue as well. I know I did hear some companies say they're always monitoring data traffic out of their devices and they would know if something anomalous was happening. Don't know how true that is, but there are ways to address that, but that adds another layer of complexity and cost. You're not going to see IoT device manufacturers go to that level because that's a lot different than a massive server farm kind of application. So I get your point, and I think it is something to be considered, but there's a point at which you can't practically cover everything. So you have to have checks and balances in place, but exactly where that line is, I think we're going to have to figure out as we go. Fair? Okay. Yeah.
Thanks so much for the presentation, Avi Ishavsky. Question is, since the speed of business innovation and consumer demand are so much faster than regulation, are you seeing any data around consumers actually skewing more toward safer products that are more transparent? I mean, picking up on some prior questions of, companies that are actually talking about, hey, we're actually not sharing a lot of that data. Do consumers, are you finding, care about that? Or are we just under this new social contract where I just give up my data?
You mean in their actual purchasing behavior?
In the purchasing behavior,
Okay.
At a level that even if early trend line, that could start tipping things toward, okay, now part of my new business calculation is I'm actually going to be more responsible about the data as a selling point as opposed
Right.
to.
Yeah, and I think I showed a couple of the surveys there. I think generally the survey of do I care about security and privacy is on the uptrend. Do I actually purchase based on it? I've seen mixed results. In some cases, very low percent actually do. And as I said in the talk, I really think that's due to the fact that it's hard to find that information more so than people would they care or not. Because, and it's where theory meets reality, right? So in theory, when you ask them a survey question, if you knew that these products had better security and privacy, would you buy them? And sometimes the survey even says even at 10% higher price, just to pick a number. And the answers often are yes, but the behavior itself doesn't show that. But who's judging whether it's better security and privacy? That's the missing piece, is the awareness of what's actually in these products. So I think once that gap gets closed, that information gap, I think we'll start to see more, and I think we are seeing more and more consumer demand conceptually for security and privacy, even though it may not be able to be practically implemented by them quite yet. Yeah.
So, hi, Scott Hopper. One of the things that you were saying is, in terms of what companies are able to spend for security or be able to put into their device, is it really more technology at this point limiting, or is it self-limiting? Because $5 buys you a lot of computing these days.
Right. Actually, we've had, believe it or not, we've had discussions with manufacturers who say encryption, that's a chip that costs a quarter or whatever. It's not even that expensive, but then when you roll it out through the software that has to go with it, and when you expand it all on out, it's over the threshold that they're willing to do from a margin standpoint, profit standpoint or whatever. So I think there needs to be demand there to have it be a competitive differentiator, so they do it. One of the biggest problems we've seen and heard about is you may very well have that all in your initial product spec, and you reach some decision point, especially in the hardware, where you kind of cast it in concrete-ish,
Yeah.
and you can't go back from there, and suddenly you didn't build in enough whatever to get to where you want to go with all the features you want. The software part is easier. Some of them are business practices even, which that's a whole different realm. You got to involve other people in the company, so it's not technology at all. But that hardware platform cost is really kind of the fulcrum around which a lot of this revolves.
And one other question was back to kind of that marking thing. About a year ago, I wrote an article, how many blank to change a light bulb, and where the blank was internet searches. So in general, I think people struggle with what the hell do I have? So if there can be one mark that embeds all this information, think kind of across industry,
Right.
a way for people to, like read a barcode or whatever. So it's one search to get it done.
In an ideal world, we believe in that too. And we're looking at it globally as well, which makes it even more difficult, right? But the last thing you want is for, a dozen different marks in a dozen different major countries or regions that are similar but not the same. And so a manufacturer has to submit for certification to every one of those. And that becomes horribly complex and costly for them. And it slows things down. So I agree conceptually. We're trying to drive toward that. It's not always easy, depending on who's involved in sometimes the governments are involved, and people have their agendas of why they're doing what they're doing. But having a common set at the top certainly is our goal in this whole thing. Totally agree with you.
Hi, my name is Dan. Woo. I'm talking here.
Where
sorry.
are you? Okay.
I didn't mind this column. Again, I'm also really excited about the framework you're creating. I love this idea of trust by design. I'm curious about how you see this framework being divergent, if any, from things like GDPR and sort of the other data regulations come into the forefront. Just quickly skimmed your framework, and I noticed things like purpose-based restrictions and legal justification for processing. I didn't see that language in there. I'm just curious, what types of things do you think are different from the way that data protection trends are going?
Yeah. So, good question. I think we're not trying to mirror every privacy regulation out there. That would be pretty onerous. I think what we did was captured at a sort of a summary principle level, the core principles of them, and we don't go that next half layer or layer deeper on the specific language. I think you'll find, and I'm just trying to roll through the list and think if there are any exceptions. I don't think there are any exceptions. That there's nothing we propose that would be counter to what's in GDPR. They may be proposing additional things or more specific things than we do. We intentionally kept it at a principle level, by the way. I didn't really mention this, because as soon as you go a little bit deeper, it becomes almost a specification. And just like legislation is aged as soon as it gets released, tying to any specific technologies or even laws can be out of date once you release it. So we kept it at a little bit higher level. So I think we're aligned. And again, we're continuing to keep track as things evolve in different parts of the world. Are there new things we should consider adding? Because if any major region or country puts something into play, as I said, it becomes the bar for everybody if they want to play in that market, right? So you have to take that into consideration as well.
Cool. Thank you.
Sorry. I'm Heather Bowden. When you talk about, just to swing back to talking about consumers, I know that when I have done searches, for example, on Bluetooth, I can't find if Bluetooth is even secure. Like, that's not even something, I consider myself a pretty good Googler, and I couldn't even find that out. So but I talk with a lot of people about this, and they're always like, well, I have nothing to hide. And I think that that's like the main thing that they think about when they think about privacy, and that when you guys do talk about security and privacy, to also talk about the attack part of it. Because I don't see that, other than the article that just came out recently about the Amazon, like the pencil thing or whatever. Like, other than that, I haven't seen anything.
Yeah, so your first point goes to what I said about it's very difficult to find. There are vulnerability reporting databases. So if you type in a specific model number of a product, not Bluetooth generically, but a model number and then vulnerability or hack or something like that, you will find, oh, it's logged on this database, on this site, that they had a whatever vulnerability and it's been fixed or not. And that's public knowledge. Bluetooth itself, I mean, there was the Blueborn attack that was revealed, what, a year and a half or a little over a year ago, I guess it was, and fixed very quickly by everyone who incorporated Bluetooth, as there was a Wi-Fi vulnerability that was patched. And those are scary because those are at the fundamental core of all our communication pretty much, right, wirelessly. But it is very difficult to find. And I'm sorry, again, I've lost the second half of your question now. What was it, your comment?
Just when you talk to marketers, just my advice is everyone I know just talks about having nothing to hide.
Oh, right.
They don't really talk about the risk.
I think people who make that statement are thinking about it in a social network context, which they may very well believe that and practice that. That's up to them. But if you say, do you care about the privacy of your bank account information and transferring funds anywhere you want to, it suddenly becomes a different story, right? Because that is eventually an attack that could happen through an IoT device into your laptop, put some malware there or keylogger, and now they have access to your bank account. I think most people care about that, if you want to use that as an extreme. But it really does go to those attack vectors and the results in that spectrum that I showed. If you're at the annoying level, so what? You start to get into the, okay, you have nothing to hide? Give me access to all the security cameras in your house 24/7. I think they probably care, they might not, I don't know. But as you move along that spectrum, I think you'll find that their perception will change depending, because they have a certain context in mind when they make that statement. Yeah, John.
We have an online question.
Okay.
From Abhijit Bagay. He says, I have learned about big data and Hadoop for analyzing big data OLAP. With 2.5 quintillion data generated every day, how can the security agencies and companies prevent adversaries from sharing information and plans for attacks in real time to cause harm to organizations, governments, or individuals, especially with the easy availability of tools in the cyber world and the rise of APTs? So it's about, how can you stop the information getting out about cracks, I guess.
Yeah. That's a tough one because that's like state-sponsored, attacks kind of thing. I personally believe they wouldn't have access to all 2.5 whatever bytes of that data every day.
I think the question is
would be
more,
a subset.
It's more about when stuff people are publicizing, breaches, ways to breach. How can you, systems of monitoring the dark web and that kind of thing to see what's going on out there so that you can preempt those things in real time.
Yeah, and there is some of that going on. If we if you put in place, we did an analysis back in late 2016 of all the publicly known, reported IoT hacks that had happened in the prior 6 months or so. And we then said, what would our principles do against that list? And it would have covered 100% of them, which was nice. And it'd be nice if it would always do that. But there are always things that could be outside those boundaries. But I guess my point on that is putting these basic practical things in place is going to raise the bar and reduce the risk regardless. So it's not an excuse not to do it. Now, can somebody still hack in some way? Probably. And there's a lot of effort going on with a lot of the routers being offered by ISPs and in the homes that sort of act as, and I think this is one of the vendors' sort of soundbite, a security blanket for your home, where they're looking at the traffic like they would for enterprises on, is this proper traffic to be flowing in and out of the house, and blocking stuff that doesn't or quarantining it. And so they're sort of bringing, and this is happening in some of the IoT vendors as well, they're bringing enterprise, or some of them even call it, military class security into the IoT world, using the analysis tools that they have in different segments and applying it to IoT, which can certainly help provide a much stronger ring of security around things in general. Doesn't mean that you're immune ever. Yeah.
Bob Gezelter, the observation is it's not a question of supersetting or subsetting, it's a question of contradictions. When you get a contradiction between a state requirement in two different jurisdictions that are mutually incompatible. Similarly, monitoring traffic has, in the corporate sense, frequently founders upon the use of secure connections, that the privacy enhanced feature using TLS effectively obviates the ability to monitor what the traffic is or doing. You only get to do traffic analysis. Similarly, the question of privacy depends on what the definition of privacy is. I draw people's attention to how effectively the UK security apparatus was able to track down the GRU operatives following the poisoning attack the other week in the UK. Similar attacks by third parties, if the cameras are compromised, or if the private cameras are compromised, are a major issue. The amount of information you can back derive from seemingly innocuous data is spectacular.
Yeah, no, it's definitely an issue.
I mean, get rid of the GPS locator, I'm just throwing this out at random, get rid of the GPS locator, and I'll bet you can derive routing by velocity and stop and start. But there aren't that many identical paths that work.
Yeah, there are a lot of ways to figure that out. Back to your point about TLS, that kind of goes to the point I said about if you implement all these recommendations, and one of them is encrypting data in transit and at rest. If you do that, analyzing the data itself is going to be very difficult, depending on where you're tapping in, right? If you're tapping into the data center on the back end.
You can detect it as an unauthorized flow to a place that you can't account for, but what's going on, that's harder.
Right, exactly.
Okay, we'll take one more question. Is there anybody else just to make sure, is there anybody else that has a question? Take one more and then we'll close out the event.
Okay. Now, when you mentioned the multiplicity of standards and things like that, you know, European, right, different jurisdictions, the contradictions, that's a classification kind of framework. If you have, is it possible you could have something and that is more numerical, like when you buy an air conditioner, they give you an efficiency number, or you could have maybe like a display on your security that might be monitoring, and you may get feedback as a user and saying something's weird. Does that at all encompass in your definitions?
There are some people who have recommended in this whole kind of Trustmark labeling sort of realm that it, you know, they use the Energy Star ratings as an example. I'm not sure it applies as well. They've also used the nutrition labels as an example of just known ways of labeling that have become common for consumers, I think, more than saying these are the ones we should use. So I'm not sure that applies, but it is difficult because if you make it an all or nothing, mark or no mark, then where is the line? It probably can't be super high, like crazy high. Probably needs to be somewhere in the middle. And then how are you going to enforce that they maintain it? Most of the folks we've talked to are recommending that products get recertified every year. Or unless there's a major, in the UL world, it's when you make a major hardware change, you know, or there are acceptable changes that don't require recertification. And in the UL hardware, electrical safety world. In a software-based world, it's much more difficult. And you know, when I was in Australia, one of the major industrial manufacturers there said, I have 1,000 IoT products. I'm not going to pay $10,000 a piece to get them certified. So what should I do? They didn't say it to me. They said it to somebody else. But I heard it. So that's a challenge because I've heard numbers like there are 1,000 new IoT products a day. I don't know what the real number is. It's a lot. And so expecting that they're all going to get certified and is going to be a challenge in and of itself. I think you'll see big companies do it first, and then you'll see certain startups in certain niches probably do it. But if you expect to see it on every product everybody delivers, that's going to be a real challenge. Thanks for your attention. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff. Great talk, and thanks for all the answers to those questions. Really